This is Lecture 7 on membranes and integumentary system. So this is the first system that we will actually cover in the body, but we'll first start with the different membranes of the body. Membranes are epithelia and connective tissue that combine to form these structures. And each membrane consists of first sheets of the epithelial cells and then an underlying connective tissue. There are 4 different types of membranes that we will discuss: serous membranes, mucous membranes, synovial membranes, and cutaneous membranes. Mucous membranes are coated with secretions of mucus glands. Mucous membranes line most of the digestive and respiratory tracts, as well as portions of the urinary tracts. The primary functions of mucus are to protect against pathogens and to maintain a moist surface. This helps to prevent a lot of water loss. Mucus is secreted by mucosal cells in the epithelial layer, and they are comprised of water and mucins. Mucins are a form of glycoprotein. Serous membranes line the ventral body cavities. We have, of course, the peritoneal cavity, which is going to line your digestive tract, the pleural cavity, which will line your lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which will line your heart. The serous membranes consist of a layer of simple squamous called the mesothelium, and they are supported by underlying areolar or loose connective tissue layers. Serous membranes are very thin and almost transparent. Glandular cells in the serous membranes release fluid specific for each cavity. They have a fluid for the pleural, pericardial, and parietal cavities, and in some diseases, too much fluid is produced. An example of this is pericarditis in the heart. Synovial membranes line joint cavities and produce the fluid within the joint. The membranes are typically found where 2 bones connect, and where 2 bones connect, that is called an articulation. They permit a wide range of movement, and in these special joints, the joint is bound by a thick capsule of dense, irregular connective tissue, underneath which is a cavity lined by squamous or cuboidal layer of cells and areolar tissue. The epithelial layer is not a true epithelium. It is derived more from connective tissue, and there's lots of space between these cells. And this type of layer actually secretes a slick, watery ground substance called synovial fluid, which cushions and lubricates the joints. The final type of membrane that we will discuss is the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane is another name for the skin. It is a thick, keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium with multiple layers beneath it. We'll be spending the rest of this lecture talking about this type of membrane. Here is a sample of the integumentary system. It's the first major organ system that we're going to talk about in the body, and it is also the largest organ system in the body, as well as the most visible. It contains all 4 types of tissue that form 2 distinct components of the integument. We have the cutaneous membrane, or skin, this being the outermost layer here, where we have the epidermis that we can see up top, and then the dermis. The dermis is the middle layer, and it is divided into the papillary layer as well as the reticular layer. Further down, we have the subcutaneous layer known as the hypodermis. Other structures that we have are different accessory structures that exist within the integument, and that would be things like hair, sweat glands, general nerve glands, oil secreting glands, as well as nerve fibers and different smooth muscle tissue. Now, the functions of the integumentary system are first and foremost protection. It provides physical protection from mechanical and chemical damage as well as dehydration. Body temperature regulation. We can tighten or loosen the skin in order to help us stay warmer or cooler based upon our needs. We can also excrete things like sweat and oil. Sweat, of course, is going to combine with the body temperature regulation component, and oil helps prevent body loss as well as serve some immune function. The body also synthesizes vitamin D3 from the skin with the compound, with sunlight coming in and then combining that with cholesterol. Sensory input. We have touch and temperature receptors in our skin. Lipid storage. This is where we can actually store different energy, the energy compounds that make up lipid, fatty acids. We can also store this up for, again, thermoregulation to allow us to keep ourselves warm. And then finally, immune system function. We have different macrophages and immune system cells that help to fight off infection. Our integumentary system is actually our first line of defense against any sort of incoming infection. We'll start looking at the cutaneous membrane and the different outer layers of skin. And the outermost layer is called the epidermis. It is a multiple layer of cells. It's a strata, and it's a stratified squamous epithelium that is keratinized. That means the primary cell type in the epidermis is a keratinocyte. It's the body's most abundant epithelial cell, and it is continuously produced by a stem cell division in the deepest layer of the epidermis. It is shed at the exposed surfaces, and we call those types of things like skin flakes, or the skin flaking off. The deeper layers of the epidermis form epidermal ridges, and these are adjacent to the dermal papillae. And the dermal papillae are these nipple-shaped mounds that you'll see. These help to increase the surface area for better attachment. Think of it like Velcro. Here we can see the epidermis up top and some of its different layers, with the epidermal ridge being the basal layer. It is attached to the dermal papillae, these nipple-shaped mounds that exist on top of the dermis. We have things that actually form from the epidermal ridges themselves, and these are fingerprints, and these are patterns of the epidermal ridges on the surface of our fingertips. These are determined by our genes as well as intrauterine environment during fetal development. Now, the unique pattern of our fingerprints does not change during our lifetime, and that's why we use these to identify individuals. Something to discuss before we move on to some of the layers of the epidermis is thin and thick skin. We're not talking about being tougher or being weaker. We're actually talking simply about the structure of the skin. Now, thin skin covers most of the body's surface. It contains 4 strata or layers, and it is about as thick as a plastic bag. So this is, again, most of the skin of the body is thin skin. However, we do have thick skin that is found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. Should make sense. This is going to be the thicker skin that we know of, and this is going to be as thick as a paper towel. This type of thick skin is actually going to contain 5 strata or layers that we will cover. Here we actually see a histological slide of the epidermis and the different layers. Starting from the surface layer and working our way down, we go from the surface to the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidium, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. This will then connect via basal lamina to the dermis, or the lower layer that you see below. Each one has somewhat distinct color or cell-shaped structure that helps us determine what it is compared to the other layers. Stratum corneum on the thick skin is going to be the thickest overall layer by appearance. We'll start with the deepest layer next to the basal lamina. This is the stratum basale. It is the basal or bottom layer of the epidermis, and it is attached to the basement membrane by hemodesmosomes. Most of the cells here are going to be basal or germinative cells and are scattered melanocytes. So this is where the basal cells will divide into the keratinocytes and migrate superficially to replace the lost keratinocytes on the surface. The melanocytes that are in this layer inject melanin into the keratinocytes, so if they're more active, you have darker skin tone. The melanocytes are simply going to dictate what your skin tone is, and they respond primarily to UV light exposure. In skin without hair, you'll also find scattered Merkel cells here that are sensitive to touch. In some areas of the body, they form ridges that extend to the dermis, and the dermis sends projections here. So the projections that you see that are fingerprints are actually found and created here in the stratum basale. Our next layer is the stratum spinosum. It is just above the stratum basale, and it contains cells, or keratinocytes, that are derived from the stratum basale. It also contains melanocytes, as well as Langerhans cells, which are part of the immune response defending against microorganisms and superficial skin cancers. Some of the keratinocytes here are continuing to divide. Most are specialized for protection at this point. It is important to remember that each specialized keratinocyte contains bundles of tonofibrils that stretch from one of the cells to the other and connected on each of these, and they are connected by desmosomes between each of them. This forms a very strong interconnected network of cells to help to strengthen the skin. Our next layer is the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum is superficial to the stratum spinosum, and it is the last layer in which the cells will have a nucleus. The keratinocytes here produce a lot of keratin. So things like horns and nails are going to start from this layer if this is going to be the tissue that would grow those horns or nails. Cells in the stratum granulosum also produce keratinosomes, which are comprised of a waxy lipid-like substance that creates a barrier of movement to help protect and allow for water, nutrients, and waste to move appropriately. Here the cell membrane thickens and becomes less permeable to other substances. It has an increased friction that thickens this layer, and this is where calluses begin to form. Our next layer is the stratum lucidium. However, this layer is found only in thick skin. So when dealing with thin skin, you can skip over this layer. It does not exist in thin skin. Now, the stratum lucidium in thick skin is a narrow, clear band that is found just in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. There are no nuclei here in the cells. It is densely packed, and it doesn't stain very well. It appears very clear, and this is primarily due to the amount of keratin that is found in this layer. So cells that are produced in our thick skin that form this layer simply have a lot of keratin and keratinohyaline, these fiber compounds that thicken the skin. Our final and most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. It is comprised entirely of 15 to 30 layers of flattened dead keratinocytes, and it is very dry, so that means it's difficult for microorganisms to grow. The cells here are shed off in sheets, and we see that in skin flakes or dandruff. It is maintained through integumentary secretions, either from the sebaceous or sweat glands. Now, it is important to remember that the skin is very impermeable, but it is not waterproof. It still has some water that can get out that is lost through insensible perspiration. It's a natural loss of water that we have. Of course, we can have sensible perspiration, which is our normal sweat when it overheats, but we'll naturally always lose water if we don't rehydrate consistently. Here we can see a difference between a very thin stratum corneum on the left with thin skin and a thick stratum corneum with the thick skin. So much different there in its overall construction. And as the skin gets thicker, the stratum corneum will get thicker over time. Now, what is responsible for skin color? Well, there are a few things. So there's the presence of pigments in the skin being the primary influencer of skin color. These are things like keratin, which is an orange-yellow pigment that is deposited in the epidermis and fatty tissues of the dermis and hypodermis. It comes from primarily your diet. So things like carrots, squashes, sweet potatoes are going to contain keratin, and it will make your skin more orange and yellow. Doesn't mean you shouldn't eat carrots, but if you mainline carrots every day, you might get a little bit more orange in your skin. Melanin is produced by melanocytes, and it is packaged into melanosomes. Those are transported out of the melanocyte and into the cells of the stratum granulosum and stratum spinosum. The melanin itself is actually going to help protect us against ultraviolet radiation and prevent a lot of excessive skin damage. The next thing that influences skin color is the degree of dermal circulation. So this is simply blood supply to the skin. If we have a more flush blood supply, we tend to appear a little bit pinker. If this blood is pulled away from the skin, we have a paler appearance. The thickness and degree of keratinization in the epidermis is another factor. So thin is going to permit some visibility of the pale dermal layer. If it's a thicker skin layer, it's going to appear to have more color. And finally, exposure to ultraviolet radiation can increase the pigmentation of our skin color. Skin color is genetically determined, but we have a range of skin color that we can function in. So this is why you can tan, is simply because if we increase UV radiation, it increases the amount of melanin that your body produces. So here we can see a melanocyte packed with melanosomes as it releases it into the cell. We can see the keratin that's in there as well as it dots each of the cells. And this would, of course, increase over time with UV exposure or with diet. Here we can see the melanocytes in a histological slide in the stratum basale, as well as the melanin pigment that it's producing as it darkens some of the skin cells near the basement membrane. Moving on to the next deeper layer in the cutaneous membrane is the dermis. The dermis supports the epidermis. Remember that the epidermis is an epithelial layer and it is avascular. It has no blood supply. Therefore, nutrients and other materials must come up through the dermis. The dermis lies deep to the epidermis and has two major layers. The first is the papillary layer, and the second is the reticular layer. The dermis and hypodermis itself contain two fiber types, the collagen fibers and elastic fibers. Collagen fibers are very important. They are strong and resist stretching, bend, and twist easily. They limit flexibility in the dermis and help prevent damage, so they're going to provide more stability for the skin. The second type of fiber is the elastic fiber. These stretch and recoil to the original length and allow flexibility in the dermis. However, these tend to get broken down due to aging, hormonal changes, or exposure to UV radiation, so spending too much time in the sun. Here we can see the two different layers that I mentioned earlier, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is immediately adjacent to the stratum basale's basal lamina and is comprised of areolar or loose connective tissue. The reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue, and we can see that in its general structure. The papillary layer looks a little bit looser and tends to contain a lot of blood vessels, nerves, as well as the smooth muscle tissue known as the erector pili muscle. The reticular layer itself is going to be a meshwork of that dense, irregular connective tissue containing both collagen and elastin. Collagen fibers will extend deep into the hypodermis, anchoring the skin. Here we can see the lines of cleavage, or Langer's lines. Collagen and elastin fibers in the dermis are arranged in parallel bundles which change orientation in different parts of the body, and this is according to the stress on that region. This forms the lines of cleavage a lot of times that surgeons use to reduce damage. So they will typically cut along these lines so that way when it heals, you won't see as much of a scar. Here we can see a sample of sensory receptors in the skin. It is important to remember that our skin is actually the largest overall sensory organ. The integument contains a huge number of sensory receptors, and it's why the skin is our largest sensory organ. We get most of our information through the skin from the environment. There are 5 main sensory receptors in the skin. The first type are free nerve endings. Free nerve endings are sensitive to touch, temperature, or pressure, and they are found between cells in the epidermis. Tactile discs detect texture and steady pressure. They are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, in the stratum basale. The last 3 are Meissner's corpuscles. Meissner's corpuscles are sensitive to delicate touch and vibration. They are found in the papillary layer of the dermis. Lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles are sensitive to deep pressure, and they are found in the dermis as well as the hypodermis. The final is Ruffini corpuscles. These are sensitive to stretch and found in the reticular layer of the dermis. For Lecture 8, our next lecture, we'll be finishing up with some of the accessory structures in the integument.